famous is never get involved in a land war in Asia. Our fifth story on the countdown, analysis of the tragedy of Vietnam merits a much more serious setting than a film featuring Andre the Giant, but it also deserves more serious thought than President Bush evidently gave it in Vietnam in relation to Iraq this morning. More than 3 decades after a young Navy pilot named John McCain spent 5 years in confinement as a prisoner of war at the infamous Hanoi Hilton. Mr. Bush today addressing reporters outside the Hanoi Sheraton, where he was asked by one of them if Vietnam holds any lessons for the war in Iraq.
I think one thing, one lesson is that we tend to want there to be instant success in the world, and the task in Iraq is going to take a while, and it's just going to take a long period of time for the ideology that is hopeful, and that is an ideology of freedom, to overcome an ideology of hate. We'll succeed unless we quit.
Any examination of that statement in terms of how the Republican loss in the midterm elections might actually affect Mr. Bush's handling of the war in Iraq would be complete only after one harkens back to what Vice President Cheney had to say 2 days before the election.
We don't make decisions based on the polls. We don't make decisions based on pundits on television or whether or not it's popular. It's the right thing to do, and that's why we're doing it.
So will the vote on Tuesday have any effect on the president's Iraq policy?
I think it'll have some effect perhaps in the Congress, but the president's made clear what his objective is. It's victory in Iraq. And it's full speed ahead on that basis, and that's exactly what we're going to do.
Fewer Americans now approving of Mr. Bush's handling of the war in Iraq than ever before. According to the latest survey by Ipsos for the Associated Press, the number is down to just 31%, only days after voters voiced their displeasure in more practical terms at the polls. Last month, approval was 5 points higher at 36%. We call on Lawrence Korb, Assistant Secretary of Defense during the Reagan administration, and these days a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Mr. Korb, a pleasure to speak with you again, sir.
Nice to be with you.
Obviously, there are lessons in Vietnam that could still be applied to Iraq, but does any informed student of history think the foremost of them is we win if we don't quit? Does anybody who makes that statement have any credibility on the topic?
Nobody that I know of. I mean, the problem in Vietnam is you were trying to prop up a government that had no support among the people in Vietnam, and you had 600,000 troops there, and you were still not able to achieve a military victory because you didn't have a government that had the support of the people.
I want to run my top 2 or 3 lessons of Vietnam past you and see if you think any of them would also be among your foremost lessons. Number 1 being, if you start the war, or at least the full-scale war, under false pretenses, whether it was Bush and WMD or Lyndon Johnson and the exaggeration, at least, about the attack on the U.S. Maddox in the Gulf of Tonkin, your war is probably not going to go well.
Well, it's not going to go well because the people are eventually going to find out that you did it under false pretenses. The Johnson administration was actually trying to provoke Vietnam into doing something. They had the plans already before the Gulf of Tonkin incident happened, and it turned out they read into it much more than really happened.
The second lesson, don't make it into more than it is. Don't turn it into the end of civilization if you don't win. In Vietnam, we all remember the phrase, the domino theory. We did not win in Vietnam. We did not prevent the communists from taking over. The President of the United States is there 30 years later negotiating deals and at the center of the Asian summit, much as we took Iraq and made that into supposedly the front ground of the war on terror. Is there a lesson from Vietnam for that, too?
There's 2 lessons. One, don't overhype the threat. The fact of the matter is that had we not got out of Vietnam when we did, we wouldn't have won the Cold War. And if we don't get out of Iraq, we're not going to win this war on terror. It's not going to be the end of civilization if we redeploy from Iraq, nor was it the end of our security when we left Vietnam. People said the same thing. It would be a victory for the communists in Vietnam that would spread all throughout Southeast Asia. That was called the domino theory. In fact, I remember when I was in Vietnam, they said, today you're fighting in Saigon, so you won't have to fight in San Francisco. Today they're saying you're fighting in Baghdad, so you won't have to fight in Boston.
Fight them there so we don't have to fight them here. One more lesson. If you continue a war past the public's stomach for that war, you are going to consign it and your presidency to the scrap heap of history. Is that the last one that you would select, or do you have a better one?
No, well, I think that's very true. Bush's place in history will be determined by how the war in Iraq goes, and as you pointed out, his approval rating keeps dropping because Americans are very clear that, in fact, the strategy he has, the current course, is simply not working, and he's downplaying how bad the situation is. Just as Lyndon Johnson, who did a lot of wonderful things, the Great Society, is remembered as the person who dragged us into Vietnam, a war that ended up costing 58,000 American lives.
Lawrence Korb, formerly of the Reagan administration, now the Center for American Progress, with a quick and succinct and excellent history reminder about Vietnam. Great thanks for some of your time.
Nice to be with you.
Let's turn now